Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and in this presentation I aim to look at the extent of the mobilization of economic resources with regard to the Central Powers, or at least Germany and Austria-Hungary, with a little bit covering both the Entente and the Central Powers as to how it was all paid for, and how workers and their unions reacted to the total war economies. Germany had started with an industrial advantage over both Britain and France, chiefly because it led the way in steel production and in many branches of chemicals and engineering, and its output of shells in 1914 was just short of 1.4 million shells. But even before shortages of coal and metals had their effect, Germany knew it had a challenge to match the industrial potential of its enemies, plus the benevolently neutral American economy. And shortages of vital raw materials did indeed mean it could not expand its production at the same rate. And only just short of 9 million shells were made in 1915. The following year, though, saw a huge improvement, thanks to efforts of Germany's War Raw Materials Department, the KRA, which commandeered stockpiles, organised distribution, and most importantly, oversaw the chemical industry's production of synthetic substitutes. As a result, in 1916, the production of German shells increased almost fourfold to 36 million. But after 2 years of Britain's successful naval blockade, production levels would fall again. However, when the partnership of Hindenburg and Ludendorff replaced Falkenhayn after the Verdun debacle, what came to be known as the silent dictatorship took over Germany, with not only the Reichstag and the Chancellor largely sidelined, but now the Kaiser removed from decision-making too. One result was the Hindenburg Programme of August 1916, organised by Ludendorff and run by General Groener through the German War Office. It set out to make, in Ludendorff's own words, a command economy. Lenin and Stalin would have been proud of him. And it concentrated all production on the needs of the military. Non-essential industries were closed down, and the Auxiliary Service Law of December 1916 conscripted all male Germans between 17 and 60 into war service, if not into the army, then arms production or supplying other military needs. Those working in industries critical to the war effort, mining, steel, munitions and shipbuilding, were exempt from conscription. Their skills and experience were too important. The potential for labour unrest was bought off to some degree by the creation of works committees with equal representation for workers in factories of more than 50 employees. But more than 2 million men were forced out of the agricultural sector to work in weapons and munitions production. This had the desired military outcome. However, the reallocation of labour saw food production plummet. With the ongoing Allied blockade, it led to critical food shortages by the winter of 1916. It also intensified the shortage of coal and drained the army of 1 million men. By 1918, women made up 55% of the German industrial workforce. Many German women were working in factories before the war, but total war meant that many more were now doing so, and they were now doing more skilled work. In the Krupp factory, Germany's biggest munitions factory, there had been less than 1,000 women out of the workforce of over 40,000 before the war. In 1918, there were more than 28,000 women out of the workforce of around 120,000. And whereas before the war women had been mostly employed as cleaners or kitchen staff, in 1918 they were filling the shelves with gunpowder and working machinery. Germany's chief ally, Austria-Hungary, had not industrialised as much as Britain, Germany or France, and didn't have the capital reserves to buy what it needed. But it was more industrialised than Russia, though Russia had much more potential, or Italy. It struggled at first to convert its industries to wartime needs, though it did do so. But it still suffered from critical shortages of both raw materials, particularly coal and steel, but also labour too. And though, just as with Germany, the British blockade only made matters worse, so too did the multinational nature of its empire, which added to the inefficiency of its war economy. In particular, the failure of the railways was instrumental in the final economic and military collapse, since there were often large amounts of fuel, raw material and finished products that could not be delivered. By 1917, its inability to sustain production levels was evident. Its economy was failing, and output continued to fall, leading to a reliance on Germany and a critical decline in its military capability. This was illustrated by the ammunition shortages and shortages of food supplies experienced in the last major Austro-Hungarian offensive against Italy in June 1918. At its peak, 83% of the German budget was devoted to military needs, with only 2% on civilians. Britain spent 62% on its military and 16% on civilian needs. To look at it another way, government production in Britain increased from 8.1% of gross domestic product, GDP, in 1913 to 38.7% in 1917. By the end of the war, the British government was spending 50% of its GDP on its military. France was spending 54% and Germany 59%. Britain and France borrowed heavily off America. Britain increased taxes. France and Germany relied more on the issue of war bonds, the government buying bonds off its population with the promise that they would be paid back with interest once the war was over and won. Governments also printed more money, which led to inflation. Trade unions cooperated with their governments in the first instance, accepting the dilution of labour, skilled work broken down into tasks requiring less individual skill, so that unskilled workers, including women, could do the tasks, and no strike agreements were made too. The strain told, however, and there were strikes in all the belligerent countries in the last 2 years of the war. In Britain, there were strikes by miners, ship workers, and munitions workers. In France, miners, railwaymen, and munition workers went on strike, as well as clothing workers and masons. German industrial workers of all kinds went on strike, and in Austrian cities, strikes were accompanied by riots in June 1918. The most usual complaints were the high cost of living and profiteering. In Britain and France, concessions were made. In Germany, the leaders were imprisoned and strikers sent to the front. Russia, of course, underwent not one, but 2 revolutions. And I don't know if you've heard, but I've got a Puskin here who's going to go on riot soon. So, economic and human resources were a huge factor on the industrial front too. And in the long term, the Central Powers, Turkey and Bulgaria included, could not hope to compete with the Allies' financial and industrial muscle. If you find my presentations useful, and if you like the sound of my Puskin, do please give them a thumbs up. And sign up to my channel if you haven't already done so. And while I'm at it, can I ask you to spread the word and tell your friends about it too? So, having asked my favours, let me thank you so much for listening and wish you the very best of luck in your studies. Cheers.